Our first speaker will be Rodrigo Menegat, a data-driven journalist behind the fantastic piece, What If All 200,000 Deaths Had Happened Around His Neighborhood, in the Washington Post from September 2020. Using census figures, Menegat was able to create a tool by which readers could enter their address and receive an estimate of the immediate radius that would be affected if all the pandemic casualties at the time had occurred in their area of residence. By doing so, every American could feel the scope of the pandemic as if it were on their doorstep. He worked in the past as a visual journalist at the infographics desk at Estadão, one of the major newspapers in Brazil. He currently works as a freelancer, developing projects that bridge journalism, design, and computation. Rodrigo, thank you so much for being with us today.
Hello, everyone. I thank everybody in the organization for inviting me. And yes, I'll be sharing my experience in covering COVID-19. And you probably know the Washington Post piece, which was published in September, but I'll be talking mostly about the original piece, which led to this Washington Post collaboration, which was made in Brazil, I think in May or June, I'm not sure right now. And it's basically the same piece developed by the same people, which we exported to other places in the world. As you may know, Brazil, since April in the last year and up until now, is in a very bad position regarding COVID-19 deaths. And if you are in Brazil, you would have like a very eerie feeling that even though we have like this starking figures of 3,000 deaths a day, it feels like nobody cares anymore about what's going. There are virtually no social distancing official measures implemented by the government, and people are just going on with their daily lives as if nothing was happening. And this feeling was very unnerving for me as a journalist. And our goal with this project was mostly to break this numbness and break this feeling of apathy and make people understand better the scale of the crisis we are seeing. And basically, I started thinking first, not only me, but all the people involved in this project was like a huge collaboration. I'll go into that later. But why were people not caring that much about the pandemic? I mean, we as journalists, we were covering that every single day. If you sit down on your couch to watch the evening news in Brazil, like the major news show, every day you would see charts like this that show the moving average of deaths in the country. You would see the estimate of the transmission rates, the famous R0. You would see even these maps here that show which states are in a bad, better or worse shape. But even though we are doing all of that and we were reporting on numbers every single day, it felt that this was not enough. And there's a concept which is very useful by the researcher and database expert Stephen Field, that is quantitative numbing. This is the idea that when we repeat numbers on, and when they are ever increasing, people lose the sense of scale and lose the ability to connect these numbers to a real event on the world. It leads to a disconnection between what you are reporting, which are only numbers, and what's happening on the ground. And I kind of noticed that one day when I was at my parents' house and they are waiting for the daily news shows to start to catch on the COVID death numbers, just like they were waiting to watch the rain forecast. And this is kind of weird, right? I'll be fair, these maps were not shown side by side. This is an older, this was made in 2019, so it's not like they were putting like rain forecasts and COVID-19 deaths side by side, just as I did now. But you can see that it has like the same visual language and the same visual encoding. So it's not very surprising that these numbers were getting incorporated into the daily routine and losing their weight. So what could we as journalists do to overcome this issue? We used data, and this interactive project will show you how it was made step by step to add context into that. And we made No Epicentro, which became later At the Epicenter. And the idea is that you input your address here, and it will show what would have happened if all the deaths in the country would have happened around you. This is the place where I used to live in São Paulo. I moved from there back to the countryside when the pandemic hit. But this is one of the most densely populated areas in Brazil, and I know it very well. I mean, I used to walk these streets every day to catch the bus and go to work. And seeing this radius, which is actually, it shows like 200,000 deaths, and right now we are at 400,000, it gives me a sheer sense of scale. I mean, this whole area in one of the most densely populated countries in Latin America would have vanished. And we made the same for the Washington Post. It's pretty much the same story, the same code, the same visual encodings. And you can do that with the address in the US. You can check the Brazilian version at novicentro.com and the American version at this link. I'll walk you through the American version and not the Brazilian one, even though I'll be talking more about the Brazilian version, because there will be less of a language barrier. So bear with me while I open the Washington Post website and walk you through the steps. I'll do this very quickly. I won't be reading every single step, but the idea is that you enter your address here. I'll put this address where I used to live in New York for a while. And it starts by positioning you in the map, saying, okay, someone died in the US in February, but for the sake of the simulation, let's pretend that this person who died in Seattle, if I'm not mistaken, was one of your neighbors. He would have lived just around the corner. 1 week later, 93 people would have died. Some months later, 12,000 people would have died. This is, again, a very densely populated area in Manhattan. And this is where 2,000 people would live. It's like 6 very populated blocks in Upper Manhattan. And then now, and again, this is not now, this is probably last updated in October. The number here, it's not correct. It was data from October. You would see that this very huge area in New York City, which is very, very densely populated, would have vanished. It would cross Central Park. It would get pretty much off the Upper West Side and some other neighborhoods. And seeing this gives you a sense of scale. Again, I know this is streets. I used to take the subway there every day, so it hits home very, very heavily. And from then we start moving to other places. And there's a narrative effect here that we start from this very personal position that the person knows well, and we start zooming out to show how it would affect other places as well. The big city of Paterson, New Jersey would have completely vanished if all deaths happened there. Actually, it's smaller than the number of deaths now, way smaller, but even at the time, even 6 months ago, it was smaller than the total deaths. Then it brings you to a famous landmark. In this case, we are showing New Haven, the Yale University. 3 miles around the Yale University would have been completely gone. And finally, after taking this baby steps to show the scale of the crisis, we move on to the real data and show, okay, we were just making a simulation. Of course, your neighborhood has not vanished, and this is where they are. And then we come first full circle, we go back to your neighborhood, and the story is over. And the idea here is, as I told you, to show the scale in a very personal level. And, oh boy, sorry. Hope everything is right now. And now I'll start telling you how it was a huge teamwork, a huge team effort. The idea behind it came from the folks at Agência Lupa, which is mainly a fact-checking network, fact-checking agency in Brazil, but they are now trying to branch out into more interactive, innovative narrative experiences. And they seek help from Google in this initiative, which sent their experts and funding to make this product possible. So they were like the editors. The core developing team was made of me, one journalist who knows how to code, an engineer, not a computer engineer, but someone who had like a mathematical training and was like a full-time developer and a full-time designer. Me, my friend Thiago, and my friend Vinicius. This was the core development team. We had like a lot of editors, both at Google, at Loop, at the Washington Post. But in the end, the people who made the piece, you know, every day working on that, it was the 3 of us. And what's important here, as I told you, we are a journalist, a developer, and a designer, but we are not separated dots like this. We are very, very interdisciplinary. So I know a bit of design, I know a bit of code. Thiago knows a bit of journalism, and he knows a bit of design as well, Vinicius too. So in the end, we were not confined to our expertise areas, but we were able to make a very collaborative piece, in which everyone could help everyone in developing many areas. And I don't know if in Israel you guys use WhatsApp, but in Brazil everybody uses WhatsApp. And this goes to show that we had a WhatsApp group in which we shared our ideas, and we had like a very, very collaborative mindset in which we would like be throwing ideas out there and trying things. And this is just a snapshot of all the different things we tried and all the different inspirations we got for this project. And then I move on to inspiration. One of the first steps, perhaps the most important step in developing any data story, or at least the data stories are working, is seeking the right inspiration. Nobody is really original. Every idea you think is very, very original is probably a mashup of different ideas. And I'll walk you through some of the stuff that helped us shape the story in the form it had. And we were just like Mr. Mime, the Pokemon that's a mimic, and we were like pretending to be the guys we admired. And one of the most striking visual metaphors we used was this one. This is a map that was published by the New York Times in 2016. And it basically shows the maps of the United States, but it deletes from the map on the left the areas in which Hillary Clinton won. And on the right, it deletes the areas in which Trump won. And this has nothing to do with COVID-19. This is a political map, but the idea here of vanishing terrain, of people disappearing, is very powerful, especially when we take it out from a political context and put that into a more personal context, in a more, what's the word I want to use here? I mean, in the context of the pandemic. I don't know what's the precise word for that. Another project which was very important was this one made by Plano C, which is a visual design consultancy in Brazil. And in this map, you see the density in terrain in Brazil. The orange areas are places where nobody lives. And the lighter areas, the white areas, are places where someone lives. And you can see that Brazil has very dense areas and then swaths of land where no one lives. But again, we have this idea of emptiness, of using a map to show emptiness and create the sense of unease, maybe. And finally, this is a racial dot map, which was made with data from the US Census in 2010 by researchers at Virginia University. And what's powerful here is this idea that every person in the country is represented by a dot. I mean, here in this map, every color represents a person of a given race. But in the end, every person in the country is represented as a dot, which was something we also tried to use in our project to give this idea that, okay, these are not just numbers, these are real people. You see one dot, you're seeing one person, which is also a powerful metaphor. And we sort of mashed all these ideas together and started brainstorming before we found our final project. This is some, how many? 12 ideas, I guess, which we try to implement. Not try to implement, but we consider implementing. And in the end, we did the first idea already. But we consider doing crazy stuff. Like the third example you see here is basically what if all people were buried together, which area would this fictitious cemetery take? We also thought of doing something with virtual reality, or maybe showing like buildings highlighted by the amount of people that live there. But in the end, after trying a lot of ideas, we stuck with the first. But the point here is that good ideas don't come automatically. You have to work and try a lot of stuff until you find what works best. In this case, this was our first try, but this idea of trying a lot of stuff before reaching a decision was very important to us. Then we can move on to technology, which is what nerds like me like to talk about. This project was made possible with a lot of code. Basically, the technologies we used were the Python programming language, packages like pandas and geopandas. We will not be name throwing here because I don't think that's the goal. The technology behind the map is Mapbox, which is very, very powerful to make interactive maps that are updating live. I also need to give a shout out to them because this is there's a lot of processing involved, and this project would cost a lot more if they didn't put us in their support to journalism and NGOs organization. We didn't have to pay a single penny for their services, so they are pretty cool guys. And in the back end, we use like the standard web technologies, HTML, JS, and CSS to make everything work well. And it was very processing heavy, and we were using a very old notebook computer. Notebook is the word for laptop computer in Portuguese, sorry. We were using this laptop from Thiago, and it was not very good, and it was making like a lot of weird noises, so we had to improvise this cooler here with Lego so the computer didn't explode in the end. But I think the coolest part of this project, it's all open source. All technologies used are open source, and you can find the code in this GitHub page. It's github.com/noepicentro. For those of you who don't code, this means that you can just hire some developers and ask them to do the same project in your country, as we did in the United States. You can do that for Israel, you can do that for Argentina, you can do that for every country in the world that has census data, which I'll talk about later, and COVID-19 death counts, which pretty much every country in the world has, I guess. And data here is very important, and we wanted to be as granular as possible. We relied in the work in the Brazilian version of Brazil.io, which is an NGO, a volunteer organization, which is led by a friend of mine, a computer programmer called Álvaro. And what they do is they gather information about COVID deaths in Brazil, which were not well standardized when they were released by the government. And they made like this very beautiful, clean and perfect spreadsheet, which made it very easy for us to use. So we use data from them. So thank you, Álvaro. And we also used the Census Tract data from the Brazilian Geography and Statistics Institute. In the case of the United States, we use COVID-19 death data from the Washington Post, which they were collecting by themselves, and census data from the Statistics Office in the USA. And what does Census Tract data look like? This is a census tract in the city I'm living right now, Ponta Grossa. And every one of these polygons, which are smaller when you have a city, when it's more dense, more people live there, and larger in rural areas, represents a census tract. And we know a lot about the population who live in each one of these tracts. We know how many people of each race live there, how many people of each income bracket live there. But for our purposes, we wanted to know how many people lived in each block. So we could do this. We would compute ever increasing circles, and we would calculate how many people, how many tracts the circle was touching, and compute how many people were in this area until we reached the needed amount of people. So we would keep drawing increasing circles until we reach the target population using census tract data. I know this is very, very nerdy, and I'll be glad to ask more in-depth questions about this, but I won't drag on too long because I think there are cooler things to talk about in a press conference. And again, I think the main power of this project is that it makes everything very, very personal. It's this idea of using space and landmarks to give an idea of scale is nothing new in journalism. We do that all the time. I could say that right now in Brazil, the amount of people that died due to COVID-19 would fill 4 Maracanã stadiums. If you're not into football, this is the biggest stadium in Brazil, like a legendary football pitch. But I mean, I am not from Rio de Janeiro. I have never been to the Maracanã. I know what it is. I know what it represents, but I've never been there. I don't know how big does it look like. And by bringing these visual space metaphors into the reader's own reality, we are able to reach very, very powerful reactions. I selected some tweets here, first in Portuguese, and then I'll show some in English that show how people reacted to that. And this one in the right here, it starts with a curse word like, holy shit, this visualization is incredibly sad. It shows what would have happened if all the deaths happened around my house and the radius would be 15 kilometers. People were very impacted by this, and hopefully you'll be able to understand the language better now in English. We also had the same reaction when we made the American version. And this idea of bringing people into the epicenter and showing familiar references makes the story all more powerful. And this is an idea that a researcher that I like a lot called Nikki Usher explored in her book called Interactive Journalism. And she says that one of the main powers in data journalism is that it's able to bring the far view, you know, the big patterns, the big movements, you know, the overall death counts, what's happening in the country. But we can also go granular and show how this big picture would affect readers in a more local, personal, immediate level. And this was very, very powerful. If you want to know more about the nerdy steps of the project, we wrote a text in Portuguese which the JIGN translated into English, which shows in like more detailed steps how the computations were made and how we ended up with this idea. And the idea behind this whole project is that we don't end up looking like this, like with a mask hiding your eyes. The reality in Brazil is very grim. It's still very grim. And hopefully with this project, we can help people understand that. Thank you. If you want to reach out, I am available to talk about everything or anything.
Thank you very much, Rodrigo, for that really fascinating presentation. So we do have a couple of questions actually for you. First of all, you began your explanation of the initial project by saying that one of the reasons that you wanted to move forward with it was because you had seen some, I guess, a kind of apathy from the public about the situation itself. And one could go so far as to even say you created a kind of amusement park for the audience in order to really become captivated. What does this say about the state of audience these days, in that you have to go to such far lengths in order to interest them in current global affairs.
Yes, I mean, I have maybe a kind of controversial opinion on this, but I think most news are actually boring. I mean, I read news all the time and I am like a news nerd because I work with that, but it's not a pleasurable experience. Not that seeing COVID deaths in the radio is something pleasurable, but it catches your eye, it takes your attention. And I mean, we are not competing only with other newspapers and other journalists right now. I mean, I have my cell phone here. I could be watching Netflix or watching a YouTube video and doing anything else that's more entertaining. And I mean, it's way more likely that I would do that than read a very long text. So I really think that in the state of the, so to say, attention economy, we need to go through longer steps to captivate people because we are competing with a lot of different stimuli, and the news shouldn't be boring. It shouldn't be a chore. It should be something that's, if not enjoyable, it should be something that entertains a little. And I think the challenge is to balance this idea of making an amusement park with the goal and need to inform thoroughly. So I think we need to find a balance between making cool stuff and stuff that also informs very well and very in-depth. And it's not very easy to do that in many subjects.
No, not at all. So we're actually still in the midst of a pandemic in many parts of the world.
Mm-hmm.
Could you maybe share with us how the media in Brazil dealt with reporting about events in a country widely known for its high death rates?
I think the hardest part for us in the media right now is that, as you may know, the Brazilian government is not very fond of the critical press, and we suffer with a lot of attacks and dissemination of fake news, and even with the reluctance of the government to provide basic information for the people. So some people say, and I agree with that to some extent, that the media was forced to take on the role of the health minister in many ways, like providing basic information, providing basic data, providing basic health guidance. And I think we had to step in we had to do more than we were used to because the established powers were not doing what they were meant to. So we were not only informing and trying to make amusement parks, I was able to do, but we were also burdened with fighting misinformation, fighting attacks against the press, and also playing a role which ideally shouldn't be ours, shouldn't be from the responsible governmental agencies. I don't know if that answers your question.
Absolutely. Both of the projects that you discussed actually in your presentation dealt specifically with COVID-19. What other work are you doing in applying the same kinds of tools? What other subjects are you dealing with?
Okay, I'm working in 2 projects right now. I don't think I can open them because they're still in early development. But I like this idea of connecting code and design and computation to tell powerful stories. I can share one that I recently did with the DW, Deutsche Welle, the German public broadcaster, in which we analyzed the results of Google image search to show, using algorithms and data and all kind of nerdy stuff, that there was a very present and unnerving bias when you search for women of different nationalities on Google. Basically, if you search for women of developing nations, would see very sexualized pictures, and if you search for German women or American women, you would see pictures of leaders and politicians and athletes. And I think this is an example of what I'm trying to do with my work, is using the data and code and computer science tools to illuminate a world which is increasingly being mediated and affected by algorithms and by quantitative phenomena.
Okay, what problems along the way have you encountered when doing your work? I mean, it's very difficult to get your head around these things when you don't come from the field of data and analytics. So maybe you could enlighten us.
Mm-hmm.
What were the stumbling blocks?
Okay, I think we didn't have it was difficult to make it. It's a sophisticated piece of journalism, but we were able to do that because other people were dealing with the source problems. For instance, Brazil still has a public data problem regarding COVID-19. I mean, if you are from a more developed country, there are chances that your government is publishing like very nice data sets which are reliable about the state of COVID-19 in Brazil. But as I told you, we didn't have that for a long time. So we had to, researchers, journalists, and developers had to come together and again, play the role of government and standardize data for other people to use. So one of the main challenges, not for this project, but for covering COVID-19 was one, finding reliable data. And the second, I would say that fighting disinformation, again, was very, very hard. If you live in Brazil, you know that we have to debunk a weird hoax every day. So this also takes time off of other things we could be doing. We could be investigating more, doing more data-driven pieces. But many health journalists I know, many fact checkers I know are fighting a very hard fight against misinformation. I showed you a picture of the main Brazilian news show in the beginning of the presentation, and the anchor there, which is probably the most famous journalist in Brazil, William Bonner, he said that part of his work was mostly to fight with madmen to inform people. So basically, in a more specific note, it's very hard to find reliable data still in some parts of the COVID pandemic in Brazil. And also this idea of fighting with madmen and fighting against mad misinformation is also very taxing on us.
Beyond fighting the misinformation, have you had to fight any others along the way? Did you get any pushback for the work that you've been doing?
Not personally. Luckily, I have not been targeted by any coordinated attack, but I know people that have been. And mostly it's verbal attacks and intimidation. People are trying to intimidate reporters on social media. Sometimes politicians, they even make videos in YouTube, like dropping names. Okay, this reporter is against the government, that maybe doxing attacks. So we have a lot of examples of that, but not me personally, luckily so far.
Okay, and just I guess a final question, because we have so few speakers from Brazil in Israel, and because of all the distance obviously between us right now, could you tell us what's going on there right now? What's the public feeling?
Okay, so we have like a very big event going on right now because Congress opened a parliamentary investigation committee on the pandemic to investigate possible wrong deeds committed by the federal government in dealing with the pandemic. So everything is kind of floating around the Congress right now. They are bringing the former health ministers to audiences and trying to figure out if there was wrongdoing and lawbreaking in the public response to the pandemic. So we are kind of at this pivotal moment in which some people feel that could maybe turn the political tides in Brazil regarding COVID-19. It started a week ago.
So it's interesting also beyond Israel. Rodrigo Menegat, thank you so much for your time. It's been such a pleasure to have you in our conference.
Thank you. The pleasure was all mine.